Good morning, Richard.
Good morning, Colin. Good to be here again.
Looking well.
Thank you very much indeed.
You've had your post-COVID haircut.
At long last. I worked out it had probably been about November since I last managed to get my hair cut. So my fringe was actually down touching my eyes. And I don't think I'd had hair that long since I was about 12 years old. So, yes, it desperately needed doing. So I feel sort of vaguely more human again now.
Excellent. And as Paul will attest, you're wearing a very, not bright, it's not a Hawaiian shirt because it's black, but it's got wonderful flower patterns on it.
Well, I decided as it was a nice sunny day and sort of summer at long last looks as though it's arriving that I would, sort of wear something suitable today.
Do you like summers in Malta?
A little bit hot for me. What I do like is air conditioning.
Yes.
So as long as I can go from one air-conditioned building to another, it can be as hot as it likes out there. So
it makes him look younger. Feel younger, with a good haircut.
Yes.
So he looks younger with the haircut, and the shirt really fits the time of the year and the haircut.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And we've been living in Rabat for a month or so now.
It was the 15th of April I moved into my new old place in the centre of Rabat. So,
which is also where you work at the archives.
I spend most of the week currently working at the National Archives in Rabat. Although I do work other places as required, and now that COVID restrictions are at long last starting to ease, actually starting to be able to go out and physically talk to people and interview them and things again now. So
fantastic. And living in Rabat, enjoying it?
Really nice and quiet. Much quieter than being on the main road at Blattlebida at Hamrun. So it was a convenient location to be able to get wherever I needed to. But yes, being in a little old street in a house, parts of which are about 500 years old, it's nice. What I've always wanted.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to be talking to you, Richard, about the 1940s, World War II era, and Maltese bus transport in that time. We've done the introductions, so let's dive straight into the 1940s and the history of Maltese public bus service.
Indeed. So, as you said, this week we're looking at 1940s, and in fact actually specifically at the period of the Second World War. Obviously during the 20s and the 30s there'd been a lot of expansion and a lot of investment in the bus industry, new buses being built, fixed routes, new route colours and all that sort of thing. But the Second World War saw pretty much all of that undone. Pretty much what happened was, obviously, as the war started, the flow of raw materials into the island was disrupted. There were increasingly fuel shortages, rubber shortages so that tyres couldn't be replaced, glass shortages so that windows couldn't be replaced, lubricants and other spare parts. And what this led to was a steady decrease in the level of bus service being provided, and in the end, by around about sort of 1942, the service had been reduced down to just morning and afternoon peaks only, and during the middle of the day there was no bus service. So it meant that many people resorted to often walking quite long distances. I've seen references to people walking from, even places like sort of Rabat to get to the dockyard for work and things.
And by this time there was no tram, no train. Obviously.
No trams, no
Paul
trains.
had confirmed for us that they had finished in the early 30s.
Yes.
So and horse-drawn carriages. And things?
That's just it. There were still horse-drawn carts and bits and pieces around, but even there were issues because there was a bit of a shortage in the way of feed for the horses. So even that sort of thing. There were a few motor trucks and cars for urgent needs was still allowed a fuel ration. So if you knew someone who had a car or a truck that could be used, you could maybe hitch a ride and things. But yes, there was this sort of provision of a limited bus service, primarily to get people to and from work. And if you didn't get on, if you didn't manage to get onto one of those buses, that was it. You know, you either lost a day's work or it was potentially a long walk and you got there late.
I assume the buses would have been very crowded as well, with people standing.
Yes. Well, that was again one of these things that there were some people complaining that there were too many people on the buses and that there were illegal standees and all that sort of thing. Yet at the same time, there were people complaining that there weren't enough buses and that, you know, there should be more standees and they should get more people onto the buses and things. So it's been very interesting, kind of sort of. I've done a lot of work with the Times of Malta's online archive, where they've digitised a lot of their old newspapers and things. And over the weekend, I've been going through a lot of those, preparing for today, and it is amazing. It's not just articles and notifications of changes and that sort of thing, but it was the fact that you also had a lot of letters from the public.
Letters to the editor.
Yeah, and that sort of thing. And that's an absolutely fascinating background into what was actually happening. And we'll later in the show I'll go through those a little bit. But one of the surprises that resulted from this reduction in service was the reintroduction of the horse-drawn omnibus service. Now, I think we've talked about omnibuses before. These were like the horse-drawn cabs, but kind of on steroids. They were the actual carriages were that much bigger. Normally, they'd be drawn by at least 2 horses rather than 1 horse. Sometimes some of the bigger ones might even be 3 horses, and they would seat maybe 12 people, 16 people at a push. And what happened was there was a service introduced that ran hourly between Valletta and Birkirkara, in between the peak periods when the motor buses weren't running. And that started in July 1941. I've not got a date as to when it stopped, but certainly midday buses started to be reinstated during 1943 as the fuel shortages improved and there was more resources around.
And there were less air raids by that time.
Yeah, so the government started to allow a few sort of lunchtime buses for an hour or two just to help people get back and forth. But what it did mean is the fact that a lot of buses, there were no new buses built because there weren't the materials to build buses. A lot of repairs were only done very roughly. And by the end of the war, there are photographs that show buses with, instead of, where maybe panes of glass had got broken, they had sheets of tin that had been, or sort of maybe steel from oil drums or something like that had been flattened out and put in because they just couldn't get the glass.
Of course.
Vehicles started to look quite battered, and there were a number of occasions where obviously vehicles were badly damaged or destroyed by bomb damage.
Some of them would be targeted by strafing enemy planes, right?
Indeed. In fact, it's a case of a good friend of mine, Joe Machicha, who lives in Marsa Scala. His father and uncle were, for several decades, owner-drivers on the Zaytun route. And Joe was telling me that his father, Salvu, told him once of an incident during the Second World War. He was driving his bus over towards Cospicua to pick up some dockyard workers, and just as he approached the turning point at Cospicua, and as he came out of one of the bastion walls, an enemy plane flew over the top and decided to loose a few bullets and things at the bus, and his father pulled over and kind of was sort of examining the bus to see, what damage, because he was aware the bus had been hit. And no more than a couple of inches above his head was a bullet hole. And, if the timing of the plane or the bus or the angles had been just a fraction different, he'd have had his head taken off.
Of course.
So, it's a case of there were incidents like that. Sadly, a few people did lose their lives who were drivers and conductors and things. But as I say, a lot of buses were destroyed. Replacements couldn't be built, and
they weren't importing any more chassis at that time,
no.
right? Truck.
So
chassis.
what the Traffic Control Board and the government allowed were that these licences could kind of sort of go into abeyance, and once the war was over, they would then allow the owners to build new buses. But that wasn't necessarily sort of straight after the war. There were cases that it sometimes took until the early 50s for replacement buses to be built.
Wow.
So I think probably about 52, 53 before the full strength of the bus fleet was back and running again. But what also happened was that there were a number of the war-damaged buses were converted into trucks and vans. There was a huge demand during the sort of 41 and 42 for more trucks and vans to help with the war effort. So as I say, you saw buses that had been badly damaged or their bodies completely destroyed being used as makeshift trucks. But also it turned out that a lot of the vehicles that had been replaced in the early to mid-30s, a lot of buses and things that had been replaced, had actually been stored pending future use. And they'd just sat there. So, of course, during, again, say, 41, 42, a lot of these ended up being resurrected, allocated new registration licence numbers, and therefore where I've been indexing old files at Transport Malta looking for references to buses and things, these vehicles, because they were given new numbers, were given new files. And therefore it meant that I could get some information about the makes of the vehicles and that sort of thing for vehicles that had been new in the 20s, for which paperwork for when they were new no longer existed. So that was a great help, and I found around about 100 of those. So that's given me a huge sort of boost, being able to go back to the 20s again and fill in some holes.
Good.
But I was saying about paperwork, what had become clear is the fact that a certain amount of paperwork had not survived the Second World War. And I actually found in one bus file a couple of documents going backwards and forwards that basically one day when it looked as though the invasion of Malta was imminent,
1942.
Round about then, a British Army officer had walked into police headquarters, had walked into the vehicle licensing department and had seen shelves full of paperwork and files and all that sort of thing.
Of
and
course.
he'd said to the police sergeant in charge, "What's all that?" And this sergeant said, "Oh, it's vehicle records. Burn it."
Oh,
And
dear.
apparently this police sergeant, because it was like the documents were like a kind of evidence back and forth. The police sergeant had apparently said, "No, I won't do that without written authority from the Commissioner of Police." And apparently this senior British Army officer came back half an hour later with an order to burn all this paperwork.
Goodness.
And I have visions to this day. I have visions in my mind of this poor police sergeant, probably almost in tears,
Yes.
having to burn all his beloved paperwork and
That he'd been
and stuff.
filing away and being very
That's just it.
meticulous. It's
So-
the same thing as when they defaced all the milestones along the roads, just in case paratroopers or the Germans and Italians invaded. This would have been useful for
Yeah.
them in the administration of the island. So
Exactly.
the local authorities wanted to make it as hard as possible in case an invasion came.
Yeah. Luckily, most of the 1930s paperwork that survives is actually to do with the buses.
Okay.
There's some very basic paperwork for some of the trucks and cars and motorbikes and that sort of thing, but the detailed paperwork that seemed to survive back as early as 1931, although not always that early, primarily was for the buses, which for me was really, really useful.
Useful, of course.
Other uses that some of the kind of sort of badly damaged buses were put to, some were used as fuel bowsers by the RAF at the airfields. I've seen a couple of pictures of buses that had been requisitioned being used as mobile canteens around the airfields again, sort of taking lunchtime meals out to the crews that were sometimes in some of the more remote parts of the airfields and things.
Of course.
And I've also heard, although not seen any photographic evidence for at the moment, hulks of kind of sort of dead buses being half buried around the airfields and used as kind of like blast shields.
Oh.
So, kind of sort of half bury these things, surround them with earth and things, and help, kind of sort of provide a bit of protection to maybe people or resources behind it.
Okay, like the aeroplane blast pens.
Yeah, and that sort of thing. So
pictures.
I've heard of buses being used for things like that. I've not seen anything. Whereas I have seen a picture of one or two buses as fuel bows, as I say, as mobile canteens. Nothing about that. So if there is anybody out there who's got any photographs taken around the airfields during the Second World War that show buses of any kind being used for anything, do let me know. And as usual, at the end of the show, I'll give you all the contact details to be able to get hold of me. So I mentioned about the Times of Malta with their archive. So I've actually printed out a couple of pages from 1942, which I'll go through shortly, and just sort of give you an idea of some of the issues that people as passengers faced during the wartime period.
Campus FM, Campus Brunch. We're continuing our chat about the history of Maltese public transport, the buses. We're talking about the Second World War, and now Richard is going to take us back in time to the Second World War period, particularly Times of Malta letters to the editor related to complaints or suggestions about Malta buses.
Indeed. So I've picked the period 1942, partly because
the cruelest year of the war for Malta.
Yeah, and it was pretty much where fuel shortages and resource shortages meant that the bus service hit its absolute kind of sort of lowest and things. The first I've got here is a page from Thursday, the 19th of February 1942, and it's coverage of a press notice that had been issued the day before by the Lieutenant Governor's office, and what it was talking about further cuts to the bus service. Now, by now, what they were doing was not only cutting the hours that the buses were running, but they were actually cutting the mileage as well. So they were trimming both ends of the routes and things, so that to use the absolute bare minimum of petrol and things.
Yeah. So, or as the Americans would say, gas.
Indeed, yes. So, but I'll read out a few examples of some of the cutbacks that were happening. So, for example, on the Sleamer route, now, actually there were actually about 3 or 4 routes that ran towards the Sleamer and St Julian's direction. Mm-hmm. But what they did was they merged a couple of those, so that, for example, the route that went inland through Savoy and things was cut back to the stadium at Zira. And that the ferries route circled round via Tashbish. The Lear service was cut back out of Lear and stopped at Balzan. The Moster service only went as far as the crossroads, where basically sort of just by where the big supermarket is these days, and the roundabout, and you kind of sort of turn right to head up the hill towards Nashar.
Oh, I see. Okay, yes.
So it went as far as there. It didn't actually go into the centre of Moster.
Mm-hmm.
And what they then did was, with the Nashar route, they cut it completely. So if you lived in Nashar, you had to walk up and down the hill.
Yes.
To get to the bus service.
And the buses all left and ended up at Valletta.
They
that
did,
was the terminus,
although
right,
what tended to happen was, again, as part of this announcement, was that up until the 1970s, there were actually 2 bus terminus points in Valletta. The traditional one that everybody is aware of, that was around the
Where the fountain is.
Where the fountain is now.
It wasn't there at the time, right? There was no fountain.
No, that was built in
42.
That was built in the 50s. But outside the Castile Palace was the other big bus terminus.
Yes, in fact, it was a big empty open space which buses used to use. And then in the 70s, I think, they built all the roundabouts and the trees and things. Yeah. And now, only recently, a few years ago, they removed them all again, and it's once again a big open space.
Indeed. So it's a case of outside what is now the post office, and I believe was the NAFI and things back then.
Yes.
Up against that wall there, the buses would back up, and that's where they would load from.
Where the Central Creative is.
And then what's now the car park outside the National Bank. Was the layover area, so that's where a lot of the buses would park up in between journeys.
The Central Bank.
Central Bank, beg your pardon, yes. But what they did was, again, to sort of try and save just as much petrol as they possibly could. They cut those back so that they only went as far as Surrey Street on that, the approach up towards what's now the Phoenicia Hotel and that sort of thing.
All right. Tassaria.
So it was just enough to kind of sort of just over the course of a week, it might help save a gallon of petrol or something like that. But every little helped.
Saving helped, yes.
But to give a few other examples...
We had Tesco in Malta at the time. Because that's their catchphrase in the UK.
Yeah. The Rabat service was cut back to the bottom of the hill approaching Sa'aya, so that people had to walk up and down the hill to get to the buses.
So the Rabat bus ended at the foot of Sa'aya Hill?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness!
So it was apparently it was about half a mile short of Sa'aya, so about 3/4 of a kilometre. And people had to walk back and forth. The Califrana and Halfar service only went as far as St Peter's Church in Berzabuja, so there was nothing kind of sort of through towards what's now the Freeport and that sort of area.
There's a big seaplane base
and the route round to sort of Cotonera and the Three Cities were diverted so that they didn't go up the hill into Paola and then back down again. They kind of sort of stuck nearer to the waterfront. But there were sort of cutbacks like that. And part of the announcement also said that the actual operating hours of the buses. So the morning peak, Mondays to Fridays, was from 6:30 until 9 o'clock. And the afternoon peak was 4:30 to 7:30. And then Saturdays and Sundays, there was a very limited service for essential employees only, between 6:30 in the morning and 8, and between 6 and 7:30 in the evening. And that was it. So they really had cut the service right back. There's also a note to say the fact that on Saturdays and Sundays there were no bus services on Gozo at all.
No, none at all on Saturdays.
None at all. So
no, life went on. There was the war on, right? But people still had to go to work.
Correct.
So, and people still had to go and visit, a government department or something. So this was a huge hardship on people, that they had to walk the whole distance, going back like to the Middle Ages.
Yep.
Because people had got used to having buses that they could use to go from village to Valletta, etc., and vice versa.
Yep.
So this was a massive hardship if you missed the bus and it was overcrowded or you couldn't get on. I mean,
that was it. Yeah, you either faced potentially a very long walk, and as we said earlier, I have been told of kind of sort of fathers, grandfathers of people that I talk to, having to walk even as far as from sort of Rabat to the dockyard for work,
which was the main employer at the time.
Indeed,
absolutely. And if you missed a day of work, you didn't get paid for it.
Yep.
There was very few social welfare services in those days, and
the other thing also was the fact that obviously during the war period, most of the civilian population of the Three Cities area especially were evacuated and moved to a lot of the smaller villages on the south side of the island and things. But the bus service was not increase to compensate, because again they couldn't increase because there was no fuel.
In fact, anthropologists say this was a massive shift between the people of the cities and the people of the rural areas, and there was at that period massive change in the Maltese character and what Maltese people called tahlit, right, Paul?
Yes.
At the time, this was a big cultural shock to a lot of people, wasn't it?
The country was going through a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And crisis always result in the lowest classes suffering the most.
The most, of course, yes.
The
it's worker
poorest
class, the poorest
suffer the most.
Yes, yes.
If he doesn't get to work, he doesn't get paid for it.
Mm-hmm.
If he doesn't get the money, he's no money for
The family.
to buy the
Food
for the family. Food was scarce.
Yes.
You have to take everything into consideration.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I would like to add, if you don't mind, is the fact that the remains of the railway, especially the tunnel in Rabat, between Rabat that goes underneath Indina to Imtarfa, that was used as stores, as magazines for ammunition and for fuel.
Of course, for Ta'ali Airfield.
Which was used at Ta'ali.
Ta'ali Airfield down the road.
And besides, the tunnel in Valletta was used at the same time as shelters. For people in Floriana and Valletta.
And let's leave there. Richard, back to you.
Yeah, so what I'm just going to kind of sort of finish off with are a couple of kind of sort of readers' letters that came out of the Times a couple of weeks later. So these both appeared on the 6th of March 1942. And these letters that get posted to the Times are a fascinating source of information from the public's point of view. You hear about all the official announcements and about the press releases and things, but how does that actually affect people? And what a couple of these letter writers were saying was that they quite understood why, with fuel shortages, the route needed to be shortened and that every little bit helped. However, what they were concerned with was that at the new terminus point down the hill from Sa'aya, there was absolutely no shelter if there was an air raid. Whereas up at Sa'aya Square there were shelters and things that they could shelter from if there was an air raid. They were really out in the open and quite vulnerable, stood there waiting for the buses.
Not just to organised air raids, but even the occasional plane strafing, because they would be attacking Ta'ali Airfield, very close. Yeah. And I think the scene from Malta Story, the famous film, where a bus gets machine gunned by an enemy plane, is actually filmed around that area, isn't it?
Yeah. And therefore, what one of the readers writing in was suggesting was the fact that could the route be shortened at the Valletta end to stop round about kind of sort of Blacklebider, Spencer Monument area, and instead be extended at the Rabat end back up the hill to Sa'aya, where at least there were facilities and it was deemed to be a bit safer.
So that was the suggestion in the letter.
That was one of the suggestions that was in the letter. As I say, there was also somebody suggested that to help with the turning round of the buses at the new emergency bus stop at the bottom of the hill, that a trench be filled in so that it was easier because as they pointed out, it was a kind of 3 or 4 point turn job for the driver, and they said, well, the amount of petrol he's using to shunt backwards and forwards and things, surely wouldn't it be better to it's the sort of thing. The last thing I've got though also shows the fact that the government were mindful of people's sort of leisure time and things. The 11th of September 1942, there was an announcement that with the presentation of the George Cross taking place a couple of days later, that there was going to be a special, very limited bus service running from all the villages into Valletta, fairly high fares, and only quite 1 or 2 buses, and that was it. the newspaper article does stress to people, and it reminds me a bit about what's been happening with COVID and things. They've kind of sort of said to people, look, for safety, please don't all try and come into Valletta. The George Cross will actually be taken round to all the villages and things.
Displayed, yeah.
So therefore, please, rather than everybody trying to come in, help keep distance and stuff. And that really did kind of sort of remind me a little bit about some of what's been going on in the last year.
Absolutely, yes, the warnings and
History repeats itself.
Yeah,
indeed.
in
But
many ways.
I could spend 4 or 5 shows going through all sorts of aspects of bits with World War II.
We'll talk about this again in the future, maybe
exactly.
in some of the summer editions
Yep.
of Campus Brunch. But next week, Richard, you have something special for us.
Next week, we're just going to take a break from looking at Malta, and we're going to look at the history of buses on Gozo from 1925 up to the current period.
So an exclusively Gozo-related aspect of these series of interviews.
Indeed, because the history and the events that have happened on Gozo are fairly kind of sort of separate from what tends to happen on Malta. It's been a different story, so I thought the easiest way to do it was to look at that as a completely separate topic. So we'll do that next week, and then in a fortnight's time we'll come back to look at the post-war period and start to move towards more modern times.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Richard, once again, and we'll hear from you today week.
Indeed.
Thank you, Richard. Shall we remind our listeners about where they can find more information, and also about the Memorja project, perhaps, the social media presences, etc.
Indeed. So anybody who wanting to contact me regarding the Malta Bus Archive, there's a email address, Malta Bus Archive, all as one word, at gmail.com. We've also got a Facebook page. If you just search on Facebook for Malta Bus Archive, it'll take you there. There's also a Malta Bus Archive YouTube channel, and audio-visual versions of these talks are normally uploaded there within a couple of days of the Monday broadcast. As I said earlier on, anyone who kind of sort of got any stories that maybe parents or grandparents told them about incidents regarding the buses and things during the war, I would love to hear from you. And also anybody who remembers during the Second World War or was told about the omnibus service, or maybe is descended from the people who ran it, because a couple of photographs I've seen, it says Schembry's omnibuses along the side, so I'm going to presume that there was a Mr. Schembry somewhere who was running it. So again, if that is a ancestor of yours, I would love to hear from you.